What's possibly happened is the wind generation has got in a little bit ahead of the solution to avoid those curtail payments. Those are 30-year assets. If we're going to have curtail payments for a few years to start with, yeah, it's frustrating, but ultimately there is a solution to avoid that going forward and get more penetration on there. So a longer duration asset enables exactly that. And that's why the government is pushing forward the cap and floor regime, which is to provide a bit of revenue certainty for long duration batteries coming onto the grid.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, our 80-odd nations that listen to us. And as say, we're properly into 2026 now. I can also say, guys, before we introduce our guests this morning, we're excited because we're the official media partner of International Energy Week coming to London the second week of February. And if you want to see us live, we've got a night before International Energy Week, the launch of the Wolfe List, the home of energy careers. However, today, I'm excited. I always get excited when we have people that are changing the dial in the British energy scene and also really trying to make sure that what they do gets into the international place. So a company that some of you, if you're in the battery world, will definitely know. And if you're not in the battery world, the next hour will be a wonderful insight into that. Please can I welcome the leader of Invinity, Britain's biggest battery maker, Jonathan, to the Wolfe Power Club podcast. Jonathan, how's it going today?
Good morning, Alex. It's going very well, thank you. Pleased, very pleased to be speaking with you.
Now, Jonathan, not all of our listeners in the 80 countries will know everything about the battery world. We started off our 2026 with me saying that I was going to invest my money into lithium producers, but we're not talking about lithium today. What we're talking about is flow batteries, and I really want to understand for our listeners, what is the fundamental difference in how a vanadium flow battery stores and delivers energies, and against essentially your guys' expertise?
So a vanadium flow battery works in a very different way than a lithium battery. It actually works in a very different way from most other batteries that we've heard of before, including, say, a lead acid battery. And we're all familiar with, a Duracell battery or the battery we might have in our car. It tends to come as one cell that sits in together. We've got lithium batteries are in our phones or in our laptops. They just appear, and you can sometimes get involved, and they appear just, as I say, one single cell. A flow battery, and we'll call it a flow battery maybe to start with, works in a very different way. The power generation and the energy storage sits entirely separately. And so that energy storage sits in a liquid. Ours happens to be one where the main chemical is vanadium, but that's vanadium mixed with sulfuric acid. But fundamentally, you've got two tanks of liquid. That's where the energy is stored. But that's generated in a cell stack, and that's the power generation side. And you get the charge and discharge by flowing that liquid through the cell and then back into the tanks. So that works very differently rather than having effectively your anode and cathode sat together in the same cell or box.
And I was also interested because I saw some great photos of some of your spaces, especially in Scotland, where you're putting it together, getting ready for customers. And I know, having been in downstream fuels very well, that journey from sort of well to wheel. But what's the sort of journey of a vanadium flow battery like? Because it looks like it's assembled at your place, but where does stuff come in from to bring it all together?
Okay, so our batteries, we ship in a 20-foot shipping container. And actually, the interesting thing about that is most batteries at the sort of grid scale level are shipped in a shipping container. So from the outside, it looks like a grey box. And to some extent, that's where we want to head to, because our customers want to buy a product that they can plug in and it charges and discharges. And they're interested in the chemistry and the technology and its characteristics. But fundamentally, it's the net effect of what it does. But get within inside that box, which I think is the interesting part of your question. And what we have is a modular product. It's modular in a number of senses because you ultimately stack these boxes together to generate enough power and enough energy. But within that, it's actually a modular approach as well. And we have building blocks. So at its fundamental level, we have a tank block. If you look inside our batteries, you've got two tanks now. You've got two tanks, separate tanks full of electrolyte, and that's sat in a steel shipping container. It's at the bottom, sort of, the 2/3 bottom level of the container. You've then got a process block, which is the wiring, the pumps to move that liquid around, and then you've got the power block, which is where the stacks sit within that, and that sits on top of those tanks, and that's where I say the power is generated. So fundamentally, you've got the tank block, which contains the tanks, the container, and then you've got the liquid, the electrolyte sits within it. You've got wiring and pumps, and then you've got stacks.
And I'm interested because us energy people, we're normally solving a problem, right? Like any business, I guess, is ultimately like there's a problem, there's something that needs to be solved. We've covered extensively across the Wolfe Power Club, almost at the kind of first time since the mid-90s, the demand for power is going up rather than down, whereas obviously like a lot of the time where it's replacing lights with LEDs and so on, we actually think, but as a world with more off-grid stuff, more crypto, more data centers. So I was just interested, what was the original sort of problem you're trying to solve, or the mission that you were trying to change or accelerate with the flow battery in terms of when you set up the company?
Yep. So, I mean, the company came together, and what you see as Invinity now is the amalgamation of a UK company, which was called Red Tea, and then a Canadian company, which is called Avalon. So the DNA sits almost in two different jurisdictions that's come together, fortunately with very similar ideals as well. Interestingly enough, on the UK side, right at the beginning, so we're talking early 2000s, this was conceived, actually the name of the company was Refuel, and it was thought to be an alternative to a lithium battery in an electric vehicle, that you could actually, just like a combustion engine with your petrol and your diesel, you could actually have a vanadium electrolyte, and then you could refuel it by taking that out and putting that in there. Our batteries are not dense enough to achieve that, so very quickly they moved from that to energy storage from a stationary perspective. So that was right at the initial DNA. I think, part that to one side. That's a long time ago. I joined what was Invinity effectively in 2012. I joined as CFO, and the chief executive at the time, Scott McGregor, said to me, "We need to keep this little flow battery business going." At that stage, it was 3 scientists in a shed in Wokingham. He said, "One day the world will need energy storage, and this will be a very valuable and very important business." And as maybe a little sort of green-eyed and sort of slightly green investment banker at the time, having just come from that space, and I said, "Oh, okay, I believe you." And he was absolutely right, because fundamentally now, every discussion you almost see in the news on a daily basis is, how do we electrify? And I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail, but battery storage of some shape or form is an absolute key part of that. So, we move from electric vehicles through to energy storage quite quickly. And at that stage, it was an interesting technology. And I think that probably, if you think back 20 years, no one had even thought of putting a lithium battery into a field to store power. So, arguably it was slightly ahead of the space. Lithium clearly has accelerated much further forward in the meantime, and happy to talk through why that might have been the case as well.
we will get onto that, and I know what you mean about storage. I remember like genuinely like pre-COVID, not really seeing it come up in loads of conversations, and then literally in the last 18 months, the biggest show we do is energy and storage at the NEC. Not I mean in terms of physical numbers, there's 15 to 20,000 people a day coming through, and then I was very fortunate enough to chair the Spectators Energy Summit last year. And we had the Energy Storage Association, both their chair, but we also had Luciana Berger, who from a House of Lords perspective is really trying to push on it and get, the UK system. And as you say, from something that really wasn't mainstream energy conversation, now everyone is like, but what's your storage solution in your portfolio? What are you doing about it? And it's fascinating to see. So I guess that leads nicely to me thinking about, if we look at sort of ahead the next 10 years, where do you think that Invinity can make its biggest impact on the energy system? Because there's lots of ways to power stuff. So it's just interesting. And obviously, as the leader of the business, you probably have to think about this a lot, where it's a 3-year plan, 5-year plan. And I appreciate you might not do a 10-year plan, but where do you think the biggest impact will be of what Invinity can do?
Yeah, and I mean, looking forward 10 years, you're right, is a challenge because the world's fast moving. I sometimes find looking forward to the end of the week a little bit of a challenge, to be honest, because it is that fast moving a market, and we have to be fleet of foot. And you need to take a step back and think over the last few years, how is our trajectory? Are we moving in the right direction? The answer is yes, definitely. And at various times, the slope of that changes. So, 10 years, I think, in the energy storage world will be a very fundamentally different place than where we are now. I mean, ultimately, what we are able to facilitate is to allow different forms of generation to power the grid, because everybody talks about wind and solar being intermittent. Solar for obvious reasons, because you've got a day and night cycle, and wind because your sort of uptime is sort of 30 to 40%. And therefore, what we used to rely on was a coal and gas-fired generation mix, whereby you had absolute certainty when you needed to bring that on and off. You can't do that with renewable energy, and therefore you need some way of storing it. And normally, when I start talking to friends and colleagues about why energy storage is needed, you have to start with saying, to have a grid working, you have to exactly match your generation and your demand at that same point in time. And if you have we talked about the kettles being put on in the World Cup final at half time, huge spike in generation. Typically you had your spinning inertia, your coal and your gas-fired power stations ready to ramp up to achieve that, and then they'd ramp back down again. You can't do that with wind. You can't do that with solar. You can't do that with nuclear either, interestingly enough. And actually, there's a really interesting sort of position for batteries alongside nuclear. Nuclear wants to have a steady state of generation. How do you sort of follow those peaks and troughs? You need energy storage. Spain found out what happened when you weren't able to, move the generation cycle around. At the end, bits of equipment start to trip off as the frequency moves, and then you have a snowball effect. So battery storage, be it lithium or vanadium flow batteries, solves that problem. And therefore, when I look for 10 years, if we're trying to electrify, what you can do, if you get enough battery storage on there, is to put more wind and solar generation. So depending on where you are, if you're around the UK, there's only so much solar generation we're going to get, given looking out the window at the moment. I imagine there's not a huge amount of solar generation going on, but probably quite a bit of wind generation. But if you look across the sort of central Saharan area, a lot more solar generation. Batteries enable both those types of renewable generation to be put onto the grid. And as I say, same with nuclear as well, actually. If we are going to have more SMRs, more big-scale nuclear, that's great, but you still need to be able to provide for those changes in demand.
Yeah, because I think essentially, I've seen that the most controversial stuff last year from almost the transition side, and it was amazing, both at the Spectator Energy Summit, on our podcast, was that wind and solar got a pretty tough time, especially with wind and the tariffs. The numbers are always debated. So I always hear a number starting with 1 billion, and then everyone either who's for that argument saying it's actually 1.7 billion, and everyone against that argument going, it's way less than a billion. But let's say it's a significant amount of money was essentially paid for wind energy delivery, but energy we couldn't use. It really has been a heated topic and a sort of challenge. And as you said, you need storage to bring on different types of energy sector. So I've got a sort of couple of questions of then with storage and the sort of comparisons to lithium. So I'm just interested, why isn't short duration storage like lithium-ion enough for a grid to be dominated by wind and solar? And sort of what does the long duration storage actually unlock? And do you also think that flow batteries can be a mainstream part of utility scale store-ups? And if so, where can they win versus lithium-ion? So we can almost see the runners and riders of your proposition versus the lithium-ion side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at a typical lithium battery, and we all know lithium batteries, we've got them in our phones, we've got them in our cars. There's a number of it's a fantastic asset, and they have and will continue to be deployed at scale across the world. So this is absolutely not a section on knocking lithium batteries, but there is a place for other technologies with other characteristics to sit alongside that at significant scale as well. So typically the lithium batteries that have been deployed on the grid in the UK have been a 1 to 2 hour of storage, rapidly heading towards that sort of 4 hours of storage. And for all intents and purposes, the business models around those have been one of two things: trading energy, so simply buying low and selling high, but also providing grid services such as frequency response, and just aiming to stabilize the grid as needed. And what you've seen as more and more lithium batteries have come on, the value of those services has dropped off because it's almost free to produce them, and therefore the marginal cost of doing it drops low, and therefore the marginal revenue is ultimately supply and demand economics have driven the value out of that. So at the moment, what you've got is batteries on the grid that are effectively trading energy. And when you look at the peaks and troughs across a daily cycle, typically there's about you need a 2-ish hour battery, and any more than that you're sort of not really using it across that part of the day, and therefore that's why lithium has done well in being deployed at scale. But what it's not really doing is providing the grid services you need to get more renewables onto the grid, because it's not helping with those curtailed wind payments. If you've got a wind, the significant wind asset up in Scotland, that's great, but storing that power that's been generated for 2 hours, okay, the wind's probably blowing for quite a bit longer than that period of time. And what you need to be able to do is store it for long enough to be able to send that down the transmission network as the sort of as demand grows in the sort of typically the south of England, or the wind sort of tails off a bit. And therefore you need an asset that is capable of storing for a longer period of time. And typically when you plot what's needed, a sort of 6 to 8 hour duration asset does deal with the top of that bell curve and around that area, and that is an asset that is typically more useful to be able to say, well, actually we don't have to pay to upgrade our transmission network nearly as much as we might otherwise do, and we can deal with those curtailment payments exactly as you talked about, because otherwise you're going to continue to be paying to switch off wind farms when they are generating energy, which no one would say that's not a travesty. We would certainly advocate that. However, what's possibly happened is the wind generation has gotten a little bit ahead of the solution to avoid those curtail payments. Those are 30-year assets. If we're going to have curtail payments for a few years to start with, it's frustrating, but ultimately there is a solution to avoid that going forward and get more penetration on there. So a longer duration asset enables exactly that. And that's why the government is pushing forward the cap and floor regime, which is to provide a bit of revenue certainty for long duration batteries coming onto the grid. Because ultimately, it's a new asset class. It involves deployment of capital for 30 years. And if you're a lending institution, if you're a financing house, you want a bit of certainty on that. So what the government is doing is putting a floor on return, so they'll guarantee a minimum return for the project, but equally you'll give back some of the upside. And the modelling shows that you should rarely be actually have that floor being called on as well. So that's quite exciting. We come onto that. So that's why a long duration asset's able to do that, and a flow battery doesn't degrade. So because you've got that vanadium that sits within the electrolyte, if you were to change that chemical state into, so you would charge the battery, you could come back in 20 years' time and you'd have the same level of charge within that electrolyte than you would when you first charged it. I mean, no one gets stored for storing power, you get stored for dispatching power. So what you're looking for is a cycle where you can continue to charge it and discharge it regularly. We call it a cycle count. We want it to be heavily used. And the other great thing about a vanadium flow battery is it doesn't degrade with cycles. That liquid, you can cycle it as many times as you want, it will stay as it is. And actually, we like our batteries to be cycled. So if you could find a use case which was 2 or 3 cycles a day of a battery, that's fantastic for us. If you tried to do that for a lithium battery, you would quite quickly get through your warranty and it would degrade. We all know with our phones, they're brilliant to start with, but 2 years in, as we've been plugging them in at all the wrong times, etc., you've typically trashed the battery and you need to replace it. Lithium batteries in the field are constructed differently, but you have a similar sort of issue. You have to be quite careful how you use them and how you look after the warranty. With ours, there's no restriction on the number of times you can cycle them, put them out into the field, and they work. And by the way, if we're talking about other differences between the two, every time now I unfortunately end up traveling around because of the business quite a bit, and every time I step on the plane I ask, have I put any lithium batteries in my hold? What have I got in? Do I plug them in there? There is a fire risk to lithium batteries. We've seen big, large-scale lithium batteries catch fire, and that's been hugely problematic. In California, you can't put a lithium battery anywhere near a residential area. There's a lot of concerns in the UK from planning applications with lithium batteries going next to residential areas. Vanadium electrolyte is fundamentally water. The majority of that is water, and therefore there is not negligible fire risk. There's zero fire risk from our batteries at all. So that's why we can stack them together. We can put them on top of each other. So again, we are looking to have some of our batteries put in areas next to, say, you could put it next to hydrogen, for instance. You wouldn't put a lithium battery next to a hydrogen facility. You would absolutely do that with a vanadium flow battery. So many different sort of areas that can come in.
I think that's really exciting. There's 2 points there that are raised that always have concern, is that it always frustrates me in a way, because I've literally worked in the windiest places on earth in my career. I've worked in Den Haag in the Netherlands, on the coast when I was a Shell guy. I've worked up in Aberdeen. I studied up in the northeast, and I was always thinking, it is bonkers, this situation where there is so much wind power in that sort of North European corridor between the UK and the Netherlands and Scandinavia. And then you hear people with the frustration that you can't store it. So I think it sounds fantastic that potentially this is the way we crack that to scale. And the second thing is, on fire, it's really interesting. My father was a nuclear engineer, and he always talked about the fundamental trouble they had was when something like a Chernobyl happened or something like that, it really put the whole industry back, because, as I say, it created risk. And I know in my own side downstream, when in North London there was that explosion, and essentially it changed the whole industry forever, where you could store petrol, what you could do, rightly so. But I think you've hit on a key factor there, that actually if something is safe in storage levels, it makes it so much easier for a town council to approve it. And I also know one of my good friends, Stefano, is one of Britain's leading fire officers. They've had to rethink everything about car parks at airports and everything like that, in terms of that risk, and if you can have something that reduces risk, you say virtually to minimal, then it's a very exciting place to be. If I could just draw you back a bit on the financials of flow batteries. Over our Christmas podcast special, we had Laurent, who presents the other big energy podcast, Redefining Energy, and we had a good Christmas lunch. Laurent, thank you for that bottle of port. I did enjoy it very much over Christmas time. And he was saying he does a lot of battery investment full stop across different technologies. And he was saying that there was huge drops in 2025 of those cost bases, and I think that might have been more the lithium-related side of the industry. But I'm just interested, have you seen that similar cost flow improvement on your side of the business, or financially, has cost performance been flat in terms of over the last year, as this scales up and ramps up and becomes mainstream, do you see cost opportunities for flow batteries?
It's absolutely the key question. And in some respects, I'm quite pleased it's the key question, because before, in the last 5 to 10 years, we spent a long time explaining to people about what the technology does, what its characteristics are. And actually, you want to get over that. What someone wants, they want to buy a box, they want to plug it in, and they want it to work. And, how much does it cost, and what's the efficiency, what are the charge discharge characteristics? That's how you get to the buying decision, not talking about liquid in tanks and stacks, etc., in containers. You're still trying to sort of persuade people about the technology. So fundamentally, it all comes down to cost. Now, the reason why lithium batteries have managed to get down the cost curve is because of the early investment, 20 odd years ago, in mobile phones and laptops from a lithium battery perspective. And then typically the Chinese manufacturers have now done that at significant scale, and they've driven a huge amount of cost out of the product and continue to innovate. Flow batteries were invented in the 80s, and whilst quite a number of people have been working on them, they've never had that level of investment to date. It's been a mere fraction of the amount of money that's gone into lithium batteries, and therefore, to some extent, it's not surprising they've come down the cost curve significantly faster than a vanadium flow battery. We are the biggest vanadium flow battery manufacturer, certainly outside of China. And we can talk about China in a bit, actually, because that's really interesting. I'm spending quite a bit of time there at the moment. And we launched the latest generation of our product about a year ago now, which was designed to be one that we could continue and start to take the really significant amounts of cost out of. So, we took probably 40% of the product cost between those different iterations of the product out when we launched that. And we are still now looking to take, if you start with that as a starting position, probably take at least another 40% out, if not more, of that product cost. So we are still very early on our journey. And what's interesting is that those who are sort of knowledgeable about energy storage know about flow batteries. They know about vanadium flow batteries. And they say a number of things, one of which is that, the cost is too high. And they also look at the vanadium side and they say, well, look, you can only take so much cost out of that. It's about 23rd on the periodic table. It has a value, and therefore there's a limitation to how much cost you can take out. And what we are just now beginning to show is that both those two, I think, are not correct. We believe we can take cost out so that we can start to trend pretty close towards where lithium is. We're a number of years away from sort of getting there, but we are heading down that cost very rapidly. Because fundamentally, if you look at what we've got steel, we've got plastic tanks, we've got sulfuric acid, and we've got vanadium, and then we've got some, other materials that go into the stack. There's nothing that complicated within that. And when people do come up and look at our manufacturing facilities, they're like, I get it now. It's not that complicated. You go around a lithium battery manufacturer. I went around Haitian in Xiamen in China. Very, very impressive plants. There's a lot of cost and a lot of complexity within that. You don't get that within us. And the reason we have a modular product is if you do that many, many times, you can drive that cost out of the supply chain. So there's a lot we can do just even without R&D. But actually what we are working to do as well is increase the density of that electrolyte, so that you get more energy per square meter. So there's a number of different aspects we can work on, and we're confident that certainly in the next couple of years' time that we will be cost competitive. We can talk about, I mentioned Cap and Flora in the UK. That is the Ofgem are running that process. They had 171 different projects that were bid into that program. That's deploying 30-year long duration assets onto the grid, be it lithium flow batteries and a number of other technologies. Really only and pumped hydro, to be clear. Only 3 technologies really were successful as they're moving that down. That was some of the pumped hydro assets, lithium assets, and then vanadium flow. And we were effectively 20, 21 or 22 projects out of 77 that are still working their way through. And our clients looked at deploying lithium batteries onto their sites or vanadium flow batteries. And when you look at the fact that if you put a lithium battery there, you have to work about how you're going to repower that, how you needed a flexible asset, and how suddenly for 8 hours of duration, that's going to stay 8 hours and 25 years. Otherwise, you lose your protection from the floor. Actually, it was more cost effective to put a vanadium battery on there than it was a lithium battery. And that's so we've taken some of that forward cost anticipation of cost in our pricing, but we think we can go further and deeper than that in due course as well.
I think I'd also back that, Jonathan, because I remember, like, in my world that I know really well, trucking, 5 years ago, the argument was, batteries are so heavy in the trucking world, it could never make financial sense. I'm going to launch in Antwerp in a few weeks' time, where weight-wise, it'll be pretty close, and distance-wise, it'll be able to do 700 kilometers. So I'm a firm believer in that, we came a long way in the previous century with, things like aviation, rail, and so on. I genuinely think like energy storage and how you can do that will also come a significant way. over time. The next bit that I'm really interested in is learning. So I like the fact that you said background, CFO, banking, and so on. As you can imagine, there's a lot of investors that listen to this show. They're trying to make sure that they're ready for their next pitch or that they've got a good question to ask. And I'm always interested. It feels like since 2012, battery and storage has been a massive success in Asia. And I appreciate there might be arguments about how it's funded, who's funding it, but it seems a massive success. In contrast, and I raise this to Luciana Berger, but I'm interested as someone who now runs a battery company. British Volt was a mega disappointment, 22 to 24. It was a government scheme. Over $750 million went in, left HMRC owing 300 million. I was just wondering, from you as like both your finance hat on and leading a business, is there any learnings? Because you've always said that you've spent a lot of time in both environments. You've been in China, you've been here. I was just wondering, like, any learnings you had from that, because everyone wants the big success story, and as investors, they want to know what can we learn from the past so we don't repeat mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, how long do we have left? I mean, the reality is we can take that question and talk about it we could probably have a whole podcast, I suspect, on exactly when that. And I am by no means an expert, but I have a really interesting view on that. And one of the reasons is, and I've just this yesterday come back from Hong Kong and China. I spent a week there, and we are looking to do some significant growth on our sort of manufacturing and distribution side within China. And I said I had a look around Lithium, which was now one of the world's biggest distributors of lithium batteries in the particularly in the storage space, and that business was set up in 2019. 2019 in Xiamen, effectively from scratch. It is now the second biggest in the world, and I've now sort of had 3 or 4 trips to China. When China wants to do something, it does it quickly and it does it efficiently. And I was in a meeting with one of the big state-owned enterprises within Xiamen, because all of the provinces like to have their play in a sector. They've got their play in lithium batteries, which is with lithium, but they don't have one in vanadium flow. This is all sort of policies sent down from central government. So they're keen to talk to us, and some of our partners know the government, know the sector quite well. And we presented the case, and it was all translated. And then suddenly there was a sort of chat exactly in the background. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, they've liked what you've heard, so they're going to set a meeting up tomorrow with the mayor, and they're just working out what you're going to say to the mayor, how it could work, and how we take it forward." And then the next day, I'm sat with the mayor on sort of big chairs in there. So Chinese cities are run by their mayors, and his entourage are on the left, mine are on the right, and we have an hour and a half discussion as to how we're going to take this forward. That was done within about 24 hours. The level of interest from government, and they are looking to provide us with working capital support, some capital support. And yes, there are challenges in working in China from a British business perspective. But my sense is that what you do get from China is, once you've got the idea, they are very good at deploying that at scale quickly and efficiently, because they do things quickly. Once they decide to get something done, they'll do it. There's a bridge they're building across to a local island, and I looked at this. It's enormous. It's about 4 or 5 kilometres long. And I sort of said, well, how long is that going to take? They said, we'll be ready next year. They just get it done. And so when I look at British Volt, and I think we were trying to do that in the UK, we know how long infrastructure projects take. We know about the bureaucracy. Competing with that is really challenging. And my perception potentially when I first went to China was that this is still being achieved with cheap labour, and therefore that's their advantage. They've got the cheap labour, they can deploy that. If you go around Haitian, try and find somebody who's actually working on the shop floor. It's all robots. in their absolutely enormous factory, there were probably about 4 or 5 scientists working around just doing. They check the efficiency and the accuracy of the technology. 16 times on the way around. It's highly efficient. And so my view is that what happened was that we tried to do that within the UK, but with a UK mindset. And also, I don't think we got the business model right. It felt like, and by the way, I'm not an expert on British football, but it felt like build it and they will come. Now, I don't think as a CFO, that's quite a high risk way of doing business. I prefer to sort of develop the product, find customers, and then grow our manufacturing as we grow with the clients coming through, rather than build an enormous factory. We don't know what the product cost is going to be, and then hope we can sell at that stage. In an environment where we're probably not getting the level of support you might get in other jurisdictions. So hugely risky if you're not going to just follow through with money up until you get there, and the money ran out.
And I think also I love your attitude of like that next day mentality. I think it's so spot on. Like when I was as say Wenhan, who runs Winrace Technologies, he doing these truck batteries. He was like, "I'm coming to London, Alex. I'm really full already." And I said, "Is there any way we could get an interview?" And he was like, 11 p.m. at my hotel. I was like, great. And I can tell you now, not saying there's not work ethic in the UK, because there's some great companies doing some great stuff. But what I really learned from that was like, he wasn't going to miss an opportunity. He was here for 4 days, and whatever he could get done in London in that 4 days, he was going to get to take it. And I really liked it. But I'm really excited about you guys, right? And you guys also haven't been waiting around. Like when I've done my little research on your website, it talks about projects across 17 countries. It talks about, the idea of sort of big growth that's happening at your place. So I was just really wondering, what are the customers using it for? What have you been learning across those 17 countries? What has sort of the penny dropped as you do each project? I'm sure you're learning all the time. What have been those big learnings for you guys?
Yep, and the market is changing, and changing rapidly as well. Everybody talks about data centers. Data centers have a huge demand for power. They have a huge demand to get that power early and get that at a resilient level. So there's definitely a place for us within that mix. And there's a lot of businesses, a lot of technology chasing that area, different use cases within it. So I think that will be a very interesting place for us to play. What we are beginning to see very much so is it's probably two things. If you look at pairing it with renewable energy, so wind and solar, it is very hard to put a lithium battery asset next to a wind asset, because just the way that sort of the intermittency of the wind, there's plenty of stories of lithium batteries lasting 6 months and stop their efficiency dropping and significantly after that period of time. Whereas actually our battery is perfect to do that. It's one of the reasons why Gamesa Electric, now part of ABB, that manufactures wind turbines, looked across all different storage technologies, lithium, vanadium, flow, every other one, and decided to work with us to help develop this generation of the product. It's one of our partners, because deploying it next to wind is its perfect use case. The reality is these turbines are so enormous now in terms of the power they can generate. We've needed to get to a scale that actually we could deploy our batteries to make sense. And we're just getting to that stage now. So we're beginning to talk to customers about co-locating our batteries next to wind assets. And that's pretty unique, I think, because we're able to do that. Most other technologies are not. So that's going to be really interesting. We announced a small little deal just before Christmas with a French business that is a fish farm just at the bottom of the Alps. They've got existing solar generation. They've got a need for 24/7 power, and because of the way the French grid works, there are 2 peaks within the day, and so they're able to charge and discharge our battery twice. They like the fact that it was environmentally friendly. There was no fire risk. It would last 30 years, and so that co-locating with solar was a really interesting one as well. And we call that we attach to the grid. We attach to large commercial industrial businesses. So that's a sort of a CNI type use case as well. So all these things are beginning to happen. Most of our projects previously have been quasi demonstration. They've all been generating money, but they've all had some sort of grid sort of financing support with them. That was one of the first ones before Christmas where there was no support. That was someone who'd read about our technology in a magazine and thought, do you know what, that sounds ideal. The phone rang, picked up, and very quickly we'd sold them a battery, and that will be delivered soon. So we are transitioning to very much a proper commercial case, and that's what really excites me. Is suddenly we can start to see these deployed much more. We are in the US, we're in North and North America, so both the US and Canada. We've got a recently signed a strategic partner in India, so I'm off next week, back end of next week to India, to Goa for a very large conference. I'm talking at that in India. India is probably the second biggest market for energy storage forecast to between now and 2030. And I talked about China. China is the biggest market for energy storage. They understand vanadium flow batteries, and we have some great partnerships there. We do some of our initial manufacturing as it is in China. So therefore, you say, how can a British business take on the Chinese market? Well, we'll be doing it from within China. So therefore, we can benefit from all those economies of scale and that way of thinking, rather than necessarily sort of doing it in the UK and exporting it. It's still British technology. We can make sure we look after the IP, etc. That's critically important. Still sort of get the value back to the UK, but doing it with a sort of a Chinese mindset.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. And I got to say, as someone who enjoys my French Alps as much as I enjoy my energy podcast, I will happily do a follow-up later on the season, and we go to that fish farm. So I think that leads nicely, like, sort of into, I guess, a world that you play often, right? A world that I do work when I'm not in the podcast, and the world that very, very much enjoyed the various summits we do. And I'm presenting something at the NEC at Technology Live in March about how do we get investment into the sector. It was a world you came from. I was just interested, how can we start getting back in quicker? Because I've always felt in the UK, it's been very, very stop-start. There's been periods of where there might be some sort of policy that gets a good start. Then there's a bit of a watering down of the policy. Funding gets stopped kind of either overnight or drip feed. And I was just wondering, like, whether you're advising a government or a major investor, what are the 2 or 3 changes that we could most quickly unlock large-scale sort of energy storage investment into this area?
Yeah, we're talking to the current administration quite significantly at the moment, really on that point. And because we're active in the US, Canada, India, China, etc., you can see what other jurisdictions do. And it can seem quite frustrating because the UK does seem to be quite reluctant to publicly back a British champion sometimes. It's very much leave the market forces, provide some support. And the problem in doing that in a global marketplace is you just end up having foreign competition coming in and snaffling off everyone's, particularly as we've got high power prices in the UK, which makes it less efficient to do that. So I think we need to, as the UK, be just a bit braver and say, look, we talk about wanting a clean transition and generate jobs in the UK. Let's be fundamentally clear as to how that happens and what's stopping that happening. So, we the cap and floor program in the UK, we've got 16.7 gigawatt hours of battery storage projects, which, if they're all successful, that is in the many billions of pounds worth of revenue to us potential. And we've said that could create 1,000 jobs in the UK between now and 2030, and those would be permanent jobs creating export capacity. However, there is an additional cost for us doing it in the UK. It's not significant. It's probably up to sort of 5-10%, potentially more. The alternative is I could manufacture all of those batteries in China and have them delivered to China, delivered to the UK, creating almost no jobs. And so we're very much saying to the government, our customers, which are UK utilities, UK financing houses, want to buy a British product, but it's got to be cost effective versus the alternative. And you need to find a way of bridging that gap. And therefore, when you're looking at this competition, give some bonus for UK content. Be overt and say about it. If you're putting in, if you are doing something that's creating UK jobs, we will give you an advantage over something that's not. So it's not penalising necessarily something that's coming from abroad, but certainly giving an advantage to. And pretty much every other jurisdiction we see is enabling that to happen. And I think just being more upfront about that. And we are getting the sense that that's being listened to as well. So I think we'll be successful either way. But what I really want to do, I'm passionate about to do, is creating those jobs in the UK to show how it can be done. And I think, so from a policy perspective, that's necessary. I think from a UK perspective, I spent my first 10 years of my career looking at businesses wanting to raise money on their first trip to the public market. So it's sort of evaluating business cases. And I think part of the issue is that UK institutions are very keen to look for profitability within the next 12 to 18 months. And I can understand why, because it de-risks the investment case. But there also has to be a bit of take a step back and say, what is the market they are in, and what's the long-term route? If long-term there's value to be created, what is the competition really doing, and how is it getting there? And to think a UK business can buck the trend just because you tell them they need to. None of the other businesses are losing money deliberately for the next 5 to 10 years before they will generate their returns. But, look at what happened with Amazon, with Google, etc. I was sat in the UK as a sort of investment banker thinking, these guys are losing money hand over fist. This makes no sense. You can't justify their valuation. The valuation is now probably 100 times what they were at that point in time. So, it's a tough one. I think, it's just how we are in the UK. We're quite conservative. And, again, when you're with the Chinese, and even the Indian investors, they do sort of look at the UK a little bit perplexed and like, I'm not sure you guys quite get it. I think, getting more demand into the UK market from an investment perspective, I think works. And, I think there's a lot of people talking about the fact that we don't seem to have any incentives for investing in UK companies, the ISAs, the pension funds, etc. I think the more you can do to push, particularly if you're giving a tax break to say that comes from investing in UK companies, I think that will get people, you'll get more volume, and therefore, share prices move because purely you've got an excess of demand over supply or supply over demand. And at the moment, if you're constraining the demand, hard to see how those share prices rise, because what generates that buying power. So there's a lot within that. But I would say to any sort of clean tech company looking to develop a business here, is just be mindful of what the competition is doing abroad, and work out how you can do things differently, and whether you do need to just think about your international aspect to be able to compete. And that's not to say move out the UK, but make sure you do what you do best here, but use a global marketplace to your advantage.
Jonathan, you're spot on. I want to say to banks, because I'm in a very old school business as well, outside of energy. I build and run children's nurseries. And all of the high street banks are like, we'll lend money to you, Alex, once it's open. I don't need the money when it's open. Like I say to people, it's like just like as you say, any business where it's a flow battery, Amazon or so on, you need the investment at the start. It's the cash flow at the start that's the problem, not once you're up and running and got customers. As you say, like when you're getting to the point of a profitable customer thing where the customer's happy with the price, you can make profitability. That's not when you need the money. When you need the money at the start of the R&D. So I'm so glad we're seeing from me. Now you talked about jobs. As a podcast, we are launching the Wolfe List on the 9th of February, the new home of energy careers. We are building it up, and in September there'll be one place, almost like a yellow pages of all the energy jobs. Can you sort of tell us a bit of where you think the sort of young engineer or the climate-focused professional who's at university right now, why should they join Invinity? I mean, like, it's been an awesome lead up to this question, but essentially, like, why do you think their career will have a great opportunity by joining someone like Invinity?
Yeah, and we don't have any problem recruiting in the UK or elsewhere because I evangelise about the story. My colleagues evangelise the stories, and I can tell when I speak to friends as well. If you sit at a dinner party, you've got people in different careers, but actually I talk about energy storage and power and electrification and climate change, and everyone suddenly is like, wow. Do you know what? We're actually doing something in the UK. We're manufacturing in the UK. How many manufacturing businesses do you know in the UK and can speak to someone that is in a sector that is really quite exciting? And is whatever your view on climate change, I mean, if you are positive on doing something from a climate change perspective, then it's an easy sell. Obviously what we are doing is allowing more renewable energy to get onto the grid, reducing carbon emissions. So, big tick. But even if that's not your bag, electrification and reducing power prices is everybody's bag, because we have the highest power prices in the G7, most of the Western world, because of our energy mix, because of the structure, because the fact that most of the time natural gas is the last electron that comes on the grid. It sets the price. That's an international price for natural gas. They're peaking plants. It's a very high cost of generating power. The way to reduce that reliance on natural gas is more renewable energy, which, as we know from a marginal cost perspective, is effectively zero. That comes from energy storage. So we are part of the solution to reducing the power price for consumers, but also for industrial businesses and for manufacturers to make it more efficient to manufacture here. So, if you really want to do something good, you can, you are helping out the economics, you're helping out jobs, you're helping out manufacturing and the climate change agenda as well. There's very few places you can go and work where there's a demonstrable benefit to what you're doing.
That is spot on, and certainly, it's been a pleasure working at it. I'm also interested in you, Jonathan, because it's not often we always get the opportunity to thing. I appreciate you in time this morning, but we're on to the final run now. But I'm interested sort of what type of leader you are, and what are the worst days or toughest days as CEO and the best days. But I was really interested. Normally, when I stalk people on LinkedIn, what I don't come across is an association with modern pentathlon, and if I understand correctly, you had a role there, and obviously, my understanding is there's this mixture of fencing, swimming, obstacle courses, pistol shooting, cross country. So can you just tell us a little bit what your life in modern pentathlon, and then what type of CEO you are, and what have been the good days and what have been the very tough days?
Yeah, no, of course. So modern pentathlon is actually the oldest Olympic discipline that there is, and still protected by I think the Olympic Association for that reason. And it was designed to be something that you couldn't, just because you were hugely athletic didn't mean you would necessarily be that successful in modern pentathlon, because also you had to have the skill of firing a pistol and the fencing side. I mean, I got into that because my daughter was a very good athlete. She was a very good swimmer, and this is probably age about 11 or so, was competing and ended up competing for GB. In fact, I was lucky enough to take her to Florida to compete in what was then the sort of the biathlon championships. So I went with her to that. But I thought, how can I help out? So it was a pro bono role, and they were looking for someone to sort of come in and sort of chair the finance committee. So I said, look, I've got a finance background. I've got a daughter who is benefiting from your association. So I applied and got the job, and was there for sort of two or so years, and chaired the finance committee as senior non-exec director. So it was great to be basically sat on the committee for an Olympic sport. That was that was fantastic. That was really interesting, just to see how sort of Olympic sports work their way through, and to be able to help out on an entirely pro bono basis and meet some interesting people. So I enjoyed that. I'm surprised you also didn't pick up, and you mentioned nurseries. I was involved in the education sector, and separately, let's have a discussion about that, because that's a tough gig, but fascinating as well. Really fascinating as well. But in terms of the type of leader, I mean, I think I'd like to lead from the front, and by that, if I would never ask someone to do something that I'm not prepared to do so myself. So, I want to be empathetic with people, and understanding. If someone says, I've got a holiday booked, I say, go. If I ever have to say, please don't, or I need to call you on a holiday, it's because I need to speak to you. And that I would only be calling you if it's an absolute must, because people need to relax and go off when they want to. I do that I've got that approach myself, not that the phone ever gets turned off. But I will always be the one who is, they're leading from the front and not saying this is something that I shouldn't be doing. I'll do that, and I think people like also to have someone to make the decisions, and I think it's important as a leader to be clear that you listen to people's views and then form a view and strategy, and then say, look, this is something that I will take. The buck stops with me. I've decided to do this. I've listened, but actually we need some direction, and this is the path we are going in. And I think people quite like to hear that. I wouldn't say people like to be led, but they like the direction. And for someone to say, yeah, actually, someone's understood, they've listened to me, and they can articulate maybe if they haven't followed my views, but I'm going to back them, and because they're putting the effort, I'm willing to as well. So that's very much me. You asked my best and worst days. I've got two best and worst days. Two worst days, certainly. I was thinking about this. Probably my worst day ever as CEO was the day I took over. I'm afraid I was. I suspect that's not unique actually, because often you take over in periods where, if the transition hasn't necessarily happened as time expected, there's an event. And I think I took over when my predecessor retired, but we also had to announce a change in earnings. And I spent a couple of days with some understandably unhappy investors. And those first 2 days were pretty challenging. Some of my colleagues were listening in thinking, I do not want your job. I do not want your job. That was a tough one, just explaining to people. I say the other tough one was last Sunday. I was in Sharman. I was running the Sharman Marathon, which is one of our partners, entirely business related, because they invited me. There were 35,000 people running, I think 4 Westerners running, so fabulous experience. And we were guests of the Sharman government and their big state-owned enterprise, and really looking after us. So I couldn't not finish it. And I have to say, last Sunday was quite painful, but I've got round. I've got the medal. So. Please, and almost maybe I'll call that the highlight as well, because I have to say finishing that was quite emotional. So that was a good feeling.
And professionally, a really good day since you've been CEO at Invinity. What has been some of like the sort of days you're like, wow, actually that's a really big moment for us?
I'd say probably the thing I'm most proud of actually at the moment is that the reputation we're developing with our clients, because that's a hard thing to get right, because it comes really from within the DNA of the organisation, and an organisation should to an extent reflect the views of the chief exec, very much so, and it's really important to me that we give a level of service to customers that we can be proud of, and that we're honest with them, because things always go wrong. And that we're honest, and we say when we're going to go in and fix a problem, and we do that hopefully in advance. Because ultimately, once you've got a good reputation, you can build a fabulous business around it. And so I think probably just beginning to realise that was coming to fruition. And, we already hear sort of some competitors of ours don't have that. And I was speaking to one client, it was our client in San Diego. And they said, look, the great things with you guys is that if there is a problem, I only know about it because you've phoned me up and told me. It's not because we've found it out, but you've phoned me up, you've told me what the problem is, you've told me how you'll fix it, and you get in and get it done. And so I've got the confidence in you and your assets that you'll look after me. I don't necessarily get that elsewhere. And I think that was, that's probably the proudest moment to think, actually, good, it's working. And that gives me the confidence that we can grow from there.
Now, thank you so much for your time today. Listeners, just a reminder that if you love conversations we're having with Jonathan, we're doing a lot over International Energy Week, and we've got a live event on Monday, the 9th of February. But Jonathan, I've got to ask one final question, because certainly I'm obviously involved a lot in that world of where energy meets Westminster, whether it's my role at The Spectator, or whether it's previously, we've had 3 of the DESNZ ministers on here. I'm just interested, whether it's Keir Starmer or whether it's Ed Miliband, or it might even be the Treasury, what would you like to see from the UK government if they just did one thing in the next 12 months to really accelerate either the clean energy or the flow battery industry? What should they be focusing? Because we know a lot of politicians listen to this. And I was just interested from you as a CEO of a power source that's on the up. What's one thing you'd really like them to do in the next 12 months?
Yeah, for me, it will be around what the UK government is doing to promote long duration storage onto the grid. So the cap and floor regime, which Ofgem is administering at the moment, will put long duration batteries onto the grid of different flavors, one of which will be flow batteries. You'll have lithium batteries and hydro. So that is really forward thinking, and I'm delighted that's taking place, and that will make a real difference. That will reduce the curtail payments to wind. I think it will reduce the energy prices. It's fantastic. But let's try and make sure that there's a link between that fantastic policy to also the desire for a clean transition, and to work on improving those jobs and those job prospects in the UK. And you've got to get that link going. And it's not just us. There are other manufacturers who have projects moving through who have said that they will build UK manufacturing jobs if they're successful. But all of us are international, and it's not that we need a reason, it's our customers need a reason to tell us to do that. And that therefore, my Ofgem is administering this. They're very, very keen on, low prices. That's their remit. But they are also, I think, supposed to look after and look at that the notion of the green transition, and to build that link so it's obvious. And then I think the government can say, look at what we've done. We have created clean jobs, green jobs in the UK. So that's new jobs, and we have facilitated more renewables, lower power prices, and less curtailment. I think that's a great story, but it just needs someone to make sure that we're plugging the gap between the two, such that we just don't have the risk of just foreign built technology coming on and solving that problem without that really sort of a holistic approach. So that would be the one thing I'd ask for.
Jonathan, I've got to say, what an amazing hour we've just had. Guys, we have here a CEO that's fighting the British corner to make sure that flow batteries actually open up our solutions on wind and solar and even fish farms in the Alps. Not only that, but he's saying, you want to see work ethic in China? I'm going to run your marathon and compete. And we absolutely love that. And I think also what I'd like to say, Jonathan, is best of success in India. I think we're going to see a lot more of you guys. I see also you involved in All Energy up in Glasgow later in the year. Yep. We'd definitely love to get you involved in the Wolfe List and some of the stuff Spectator does. But I think for all of our listeners, if you want to see more CEOs, the passion of that, where your career could go to, keep on subscribing, keep on downloading. And Jonathan, thank you for your time today. And I cannot wait to see more of your flow batteries bring more wind, because let's be honest, it's a windy country, so let's power it with it. Thank you for your time today, Jonathan.
Exactly. Thanks, Alex.